Good day, everyone. Welcome back to the Doc of Detox show. Today's show is The Truth About Lyme Disease. And we have a special guest here, and that special guest is Dr. Michael Finkelstein. Dr. Michael Finkelstein is a dear friend of mine, and I'm very excited to be speaking with him today about Lyme's disease. And the reason why I say this is because everybody knows the word, okay? Everybody knows the word and everybody is scared about getting it, but a lot of people do not understand it, okay? They don't understand it, and the reason being is because there's lots of information out there, and when something comes out really fast and really hard, information gets all mixed up. Well, understand something. We're going to get everything straightened out today because today's show is called The Truth About Lyme Disease. And we're going to bring truth to it and bring some fact to it so that we can bring the fear down and we can bring your faith up in yourself and being able to stay well. Now, understand, the first show that we did with Michael Finkelstein was Thriving While We Age, and we just did that show a couple of days ago. And now what we're doing is we're doing The Truth About Lyme's Disease. So we've done two shows, and in 2 days we're going to be doing a Q&A on both of these shows. So make sure to join us live, okay, at 3 p.m. Pacific Standard Time in 2 days from now, and we will be answering all your questions from these two shows. And if you can't, then make sure you put your questions in on Intercom. Let us know that it's for the Dr. Finkelstein shows. And on Intercom, Facebook, YouTube, or you can call in your questions. All right? Just know that we're here and this is your show. Dr. Finkelstein, thank you for joining me again.
It's always a pleasure.
Very good. So let's jump right into this. And I think the first question that is on my mind is, what exactly is Lyme disease?
Well, I wish I had a very simple answer. I don't. The answer that I'll give you, though, is let's start with where the term comes from, and then I'll go into a little bit of the history of the development of this condition, because it's not the same as it used to be. And that's part of the confusion. So Lyme disease was a term coined around 1975 when a cluster of cases was reported by a physician in Lyme, Connecticut, a town near the coast of the Long Island Sound, where a bunch of people, mostly children, were getting this unusual rash. And he reported the cluster of cases, and it got identified as Lyme disease. It wasn't clear at that moment what it was. It was several years later that research went into it to find that there was a bacteria, Borrelia burgdorferi, was named after the man who found it under the microscope, a specific type of bacteria that caused that particular syndrome. At the time, in the 1970s, it was pretty simple. People would get a bullseye rash. That's the classic rash associated with Lyme disease that a lot of people know. The rings, concentric rings of redness on the body anywhere. That was what these children had, or they had a funny type of swelling of a joint.
Could you mistaken this for ringworm or no?
Sometimes you can. You know, what's interesting about Lyme disease, what's interesting about dermatology in general, I found fascinating in medical school, is a lot of, the body's skin reacts only in a certain number of ways. Rashes, we use that word rash, but a lot of things look alike. What is pretty important about Lyme disease, though, it can masquerade as many other things. It could look like, ringworm. It could look like shingles. It could look like it's sort of a abscess. It could look like a pimple. It could be odd. So the classic ring, concentric rings, is maybe less than 50% of people ever actually get it, which is another aspect of Lyme disease, which makes it difficult, because not everyone gets the obvious first symptom where it's early and relatively easy to treat at that time for many people with a simple dose of antibiotics. Well, so the 1970s was pretty straightforward. People would get this rash typically, or they would get this arthritis, and they would get treated with a antibiotic, usually doxycycline or amoxicillin, and do pretty well. Not everyone did, though. What was interesting, so even early on, there was a group of people who suffered from some sort of chronic syndrome that followed that initial rash, or sometimes they didn't have the initial rash. They had somewhat of a prodrome, meaning before the syndrome begins, they had a little bit of a nondescript illness that might look like a virus, like I have flu and achiness and fever. That's nondescript. It could be a lot of viruses do that, a lot of other infections do that, and Lyme disease could do that. So some people would develop that sort of initial prodrome without a rash and be sick and not know why. Doctors in the area where I live, because I lived and worked in that area, as it turned out, in the 70s and 80s, were sort of slow to the take. A lot of people would have symptoms and illnesses, and it wasn't clear. Not everyone read the literature, and it wasn't really black and white. And even to this day, almost 50 years later, there isn't great diagnostic tests, blood tests, to say when somebody's sick, this is what they have. Another dilemma with Lyme disease. And we'll get to all of this, I think, over time. I just want to lay it out. So in the 70s, this rash or this prodrome would develop. People would get courses of antibiotics. Most people would do well, but some people would develop some sort of chronic syndrome where they would be persistently achy. A joint would be swollen for a long time. They would maintain the rash, but typically the rash would go away. And then another subset of people would develop more significant manifestations, neurological manifestations, like brain fog or facial palsies, more significant problems with their autonomic nervous system. So some people got very sick, and doses of antibiotics wouldn't necessarily help them. And so it became clear that Lyme disease was a number of different types of things, even though it was caused, at that time, thought to be caused by that one bacteria. But with more and more research, what becomes clear is that Lyme disease typically, in somebody who's sick and for a period of time, not get better after, let's say, 1 week of antibiotics, those people who have some form of chronic Lyme have more than just infection with that one bacteria. And that's another very important factor. So that's why a treatment with a simple antibiotic doesn't work, because there's more than one infection. The other aspect of it is...
Would you call that, I don't mean to butt in, but would you call that a complex disease where there's just many other factors or diseases? It's like a layered thing.
Yes, it's very complex. So Lyme, the reason it's such an important subject, and in your introduction, you mentioned it, a lot of people, get a little bit worked up when they hear Lyme or they think they have Lyme, and they don't understand it. And it really sort of came down on us hard with a bang around that time. And it's been getting worse. This is another phenomenon. Whatever is happening to this syndrome and it's getting more complex. What seems to happen is when people get infected initially, they're getting infected with more than one disease, infectious disease. And it's also preying on their immune system and allowing many other infectious diseases that they've had in their lifetime before to be recurring. And it tends to affect the body's ability to deal with toxic material like heavy metals and chemicals in the environment. And so people get wrapped up in all these things simultaneously, and they get impaired in their ability to sort it out and untangle this knot that gets more and more messed up. And so to treat Lyme disease, and this is maybe leaping ahead a little too fast, but to treat Lyme disease isn't simply an antibiotic anymore. And that's somewhat of the problem. When people get this complex syndrome, one has to unravel a fairly complicated knot. There isn't great blood work for this. It's not as simple as going to a doctor and finding out that you have the flu, because you can get a swab really quickly and an antibody appears, or a protein from the virus itself appears, and you have the flu. You might know or not know that you have this particular bacterium, but if there's multiple infectious diseases, and it also involves your old history of previous infections you've had, and other metals your body has stored and been exposed to, and other chemicals and everything else. There's no way to test for all of that. And there's no simple single treatment that works for all people. So this is sort of a prototypical 21st century disease now. When the environment is as complicated, meaning toxic and messed up as it is now, where people are living in that toxic environment, where people are being exposed to a number of things simultaneously, and their immune systems are impaired because of all those exposures, some people wind up with a fairly profound, problematic set of problems. And it then trickles into other systems of the body, like the nervous system, the immune system, the gastrointestinal system, the cardiovascular system, and all these other systems of the body downstream become diseased because of the injuries that accumulate. I want to just say one more thing. So you could say, I said that when Lyme was discovered in 1975, or that cluster of cases was reported, it took a while for one to figure out what the bacteria was that caused that particular early, relatively simple syndrome. But it was then understood that this bacteria is a very old bacteria. And it's been around and has been infecting humans for a long time, thousands of years. In fact, the Iceman, the 5,000-year-old individual who was walking over the Alps, whose body was discovered frozen when the frozen tundra there was thawing, and somebody saw this man in the ice, and they took him to a lab and did all sorts of evaluations. He had Lyme disease. He had this bacteria in his body. And typical of that area of the world, specifically Bavaria, Lyme disease was pretty popular. A lot of farmers would get it, and typically the way it manifested in those people, this is hundreds and thousands of years ago, would be a single joint arthritis, like of the knee, that would swell and would be a problem for much of their lives, but it didn't do more damage to them than that. They lived with this syndrome. Something changed. It went from that relatively simple disease, even the relatively simple disease that people were getting in Lyme, Connecticut in 1975, to what we're experiencing now, 45, 50 years later, which is far more complex and seemingly increasing in complexity. And it begs the question, what's happening? It's no longer just that simple disease. One other tidbit. Lyme, Connecticut, as I mentioned, sits on the Long Island Sound. The Long Island Sound has a couple of islands in it, one of which is Plum Island. Plum Island is notorious because it was closed down years ago. It was originally an animal agricultural infectious disease center, but it became used by the Department of Defense to study the weaponization of infectious diseases. That is, the US government, around the time of the Cold War, was experimenting with infectious diseases to see how it could be used in warfare. When the tide is low, there's a land bridge between Plum Island and Connecticut, which animals like deer could walk across. And so what people know about Lyme disease is that this transmitted by a tick that happens to sit on the body of a deer, suck the blood out of the deer, and then bite a human. That epidemiological phenomena is made more interesting by considering the potential that something was being done at Plum Island with this old, relatively harmless infectious disease to make it more virulent, that somehow escaped the lab, got into deer, walked across the Long Island Sound into Connecticut, and started to infect humans in the 1970s. That's not proven, but that's the question that I raised earlier, which is what changed Lyme disease from a relatively simple, no big deal, you live with an joint that's swollen, to what we are now experiencing, which is this explosive, devastating syndrome that's multifactorial, that primary target is the immune system, and then from there, everything goes haywire in people who are infected. All right, that's a very long answer, I'm sorry.
No, but you know what? I love that answer. And that was so clear and not confusing. And I'm sure people are going, thank you for that. But since the 70s, look at the assault that we've had between 3G, GMOs, glyphosate, and just so much going on. I mean, this is like the chemical um, toxic frequency revolution that we've lived since the 70s until now. Would that be part of the fire?
It's a brilliant question. U.S. DA licensed glyphosate to use on vegetables in 1974. Lyme disease became discovered in 1975. Is that a coincidence?
Boom.
I don't know. But it's, again, part of my research and understanding is, I don't know the answer. I want to be very careful. We've titled this The Truth. This is closer to the truth.
And the truth
This
is,
is
we don't know.
true.
Yeah.
No pun intended. However, but this gets to thinking. I want to, eventually get to quickly. Well, what do you do about it? But knowing this part of it is important, because what we're getting to here is, no, the environment has, as you're saying, is a big factor on why we are getting sick like this. And therefore, if the environment is a big factor in why we're getting sick, then the treatment for what we need to get better is to address the environment and how that environment affects us.
Very
And
good.
so it is not sufficient to give an antibiotic for an infectious disease when the infectious disease is compounded by the immune system effects of the environment, or something else that is deranged in our system, like our gastrointestinal tract, because it's been injured by glyphosate. And now proteins and immune system molecules and bacteria in our gut are all changing, and they're all part of this one ecosystem of a human being, which is now impaired, that one thing leads to another, and then eventually you have a full-blown syndrome, which doesn't get better simply any longer.
So now
This is
we
not.
now we have like a screen door in a submarine, like leaky gut, right?
Yeah, yeah. And so all these things are going on simultaneously. So the effective, remediation for this syndrome is to start thinking about all these variables. Now, it gives people a headache, and I'm sorry. I mean, there's just a lot to think about, and it's not simple, and it's not going to be a simple pill. Although I would say, if you have that rash, you have a fever, and it might be Lyme disease, go to a doctor, get an antibiotic. I don't have any problem with that initially, if it's early, because sometimes fortunate people get better pretty quickly, and that's the end of it. But if you have a chronic syndrome, or that doesn't work, you wind up having, by definition, a more complex condition. And for that, you need more complex understanding. And I think I think the meaning value of our conversation is to empower people to understand, no, I need to find somebody and do my own research that helps me sort through all these variables. Because if I don't address enough of them, I am not necessarily going to get better. I'm going to be just remain very frustrated and sick.
Like
And that's where a lot of people are.
like the 5-foot ladder and the 20-foot hole. You can't get out. You just get
Right.
frustrated.
Yeah, and you try it. You keep stepping up the rungs, and then you just don't get to the top, and you keep trying it, you keep falling down, and it wears you down, and it's depressing, and it's demoralizing, and your body suffers over time, because this is an inflammatory state. It causes damage to surrounding tissue. It continues to impair your immune system. For people who have nervous system involvement, which is pretty common, their mind doesn't and their brain doesn't function properly. They lose their lives, even though they don't die. They just lose their ability to function. The number of people who are sick went from this cluster of people in 1975 in the United States, obviously, just over in Lyme, specifically in Lyme, Connecticut, all throughout the United States, all of the continental United States, and the entire world is now infected with this new syndrome, not the old-fashioned one-joint arthritis in Bavaria, but now people all over the world, as far as Australia, another continent, are being sick, which raises another question. Well, how does the deer can maybe walk across the land bridge from Plum Island to Connecticut, and the deer can walk from Connecticut to California eventually. But deer cannot get from California to Australia. So what does that mean? that means there's another vector of transmission of Lyme disease, not just the tick, which is another important issue.
Which
And
is?
other insects like mosquitoes and human to human transmission.
Right.
So when you think about that, the whole world now is endemically infected with not just this one disease. So by the way, when a tick bites you, if it's a simple tick, this Lyme organism isn't the only thing in their mouth. Any more than you have one bacteria in your mouth. You've got trillions of different infections potentially.
Right, that create it.
From bacteria and viruses and fungi and everything else. And so does the tick. And if one of the features of this, I'm going to use the word because I really believe it's true, this weaponized bacteria to begin with, impairs your immune system, then, and it reactivates things that are dormant in your own system, like chickenpox or herpes viruses of other sorts, or Epstein-Barr virus, or cytomegalovirus, or Candida and yeast. All these things that you may have been exposed to in your life that you got over, but don't die completely. Your immune system is keeping them in check, but now your immune system is targeted and impaired by this particular organism, the Lyme organism. Well, now these things come back, and now instead of one thing, you've got multiple. And the tick, by the way, is injecting into you at the same time it bites you, and exchanges, pulls out your blood for its own meal. It's infusing whatever other infectious diseases, Ehrlichia being a very common one, Mycoplasma being a whole other group, that it's transmitting. And now your bloodstream is teeming with all sorts of things that you have to deal with. And if your immune system isn't up to it, you wind up getting multiple infections simultaneously. And this is, what people need to know, because it's not sufficient to go to somebody who's not in a condition this complex, who's not familiar with all of this.
And that would be almost all practitioners, because they don't understand it because they haven't worked with it enough. And you know what? It's not the fault of the practitioners, okay? But the thing is that, unless you've worked with it, and I'm not going to tell you that I'm a specialist, but I've worked with Lymes a lot. But I do understand the body, and I do understand that with Lymes, it's not like the little boy who put his one finger in the dike, because you're going to need all your fingers and toes on this one.
Yeah, I think it's true. I remember it very vividly. So the first case of Lyme disease I saw, I was an intern in internal medicine in a New York City hospital, and I saw that this woman came in with this rash, like these bullseyes all over her body. It was around 1985. And it was fascinating, right? I saw Lyme disease, I was like, but because it was pretty rare then. I mean, it was starting to emerge in the New York, Connecticut area, but it was the first case I saw. And then I went out into practice in the early 90s in Chappaqua, New York, which is very close to Lyme, Connecticut, and saw a lot of people who were sick in the summer with this rash and fever. They did very well typically with a course of antibiotics, although, as I said, not everyone did. But what was very interesting, to the point about practitioners, there was a lot of resistance to accepting the fact that some people didn't get better after I gave them 10 days of antibiotics. Meaning, among my colleagues, doctors, we gave you the right medication, your rash went away, the fact that you still have a headache is not because this infection lasts. Infections don't last that long. That was the initial interesting response by the medical community around me at the very beginning of this epidemic. It remains to this day. It's emotional. What I find interesting and somewhat disturbing, instead of objective scientists, physicians just seeing what is there and saying, well, I'm not going to dispute it. It's there. Somebody's sick. They're in front of me. I'm not going to ignore it. There was sort of a refusal to accept that a bacterial disease, given the right antibiotic, shouldn't just go away. There was no real appreciation by the mainstream. There were a handful of Lyme specialists, like 1 out of 1,000 doctors or less in the area, who would take it upon themselves, and I give them a lot of credit for staying with those patients, despite not having any other tool than antibiotics. And they would give long, long courses of all sorts of antibiotics, and they were really discredited. A lot of them lost their license because of this emotional response, which is people can't be sick with Lyme disease this long, and it's not right for a doctor to give them this type of treatment. There's some half-truths there, which it wasn't right to give them that long treatment course of antibiotics. It didn't really work all the time. But it was the best tool that doctors had in the 90s.
Yeah, but the problem is that you're hoping to set off the atomic bomb and that the patient still lives through it.
Yeah, well, it was toxic treatment, and it was a sign of a certain degree of ignorance as far as what was really happening in the body. It took longer research. Those same doctors, by the way, though, who stuck with it, who kept their eyes open, who started to think of other things. And eventually they, as a group, did realize it was co-infections. They, as a group, realized there was toxic material like heavy metals. They, as a group, realized that there was an immune system impairment. There was some science that followed them, but it was these Lyme literate doctors that, even though initially they were giving long courses of antibiotics, which could be looked at as really not ideal, and what you're saying is correct, but I give them a lot of credit for persisting and taking care of people, and not doing what most doctors did, which was to deny the existence of this and refuse.
Yeah, they didn't. These doctors didn't give up. They stuck to the course, and you know what? They were coming from their hearts and were doing the best that they knew how.
Right. So many of them lost their license and still suffer from this prejudice. The mainstream medical, establishment still questions and debates some of the merits of many of the things that I shared with you, which again, I would say they're powerful hypotheses. I can't tell you there's proof on a lot of these things, but it's compelling. It's important for us to think carefully about why is it such a problem? Why aren't people getting better? What do we need to know to help people regain their health when they're sick like this, and not to ignore the fact that they are sick like this?
Well, the one question I want to ask you is, when should someone consider going beyond just conventional approaches? I mean, I think there's a lot of people out there that would want to know that.
Yeah, well, it's the same answer to the question. When people don't get better from anything after a couple of weeks, they should go beyond the conventional approach. Look, I was there. I practiced medicine. I was trained conventionally. I know what I know. Or at least I know what I was trained to know at that time. If a doctor is giving you a drug for more than a month or 2 months, and you're not getting better, and this is for everything, I frankly think that's the time to go seek somebody who knows more than that doctor.
Okay.
That's true in Lyme disease. If you've got a syndrome you feel is resulting from something that might fall into this category of this complex syndrome of infectious disease, toxic environment, other co-infections, and your doctor has tried and used the tools that they have, and you're still not right. You have brain fog, you have fatigue, you have fevers, you have achy joints, you just don't feel right. Your autonomic nervous system, like your blood pressure, your blood sugar, is a little out of whack. You're not sleeping, your mood is impaired, and you can't figure out why. This is the time to go find somebody who maybe has more training than your conventional doctor. It could be a conventional doctor like I am, who went back to school to study integrative medicine and has been spending time thinking outside of the conventional medicine box, not because I'm negating the value of conventional medicine, but it just doesn't solve and address every question. So I'm not satisfied in just being limited in my knowledge when people are sick.
Okay, so you just came down with Lyme's disease. Tell me your strategy.
Well, so you don't know sometimes that you came down with Lyme disease, but you know you're sick.
Yes.
Right? So you know you're not right, and you wonder if it's Lyme disease. And you said something interesting in your introduction. I think I heard you say something like a lot of times people are not feeling well and they jump to the conclusion that they have Lyme disease. That too needs to be tempered. Thinking that you have Lyme disease, thinking you have cancer, thinking you have this is a good way to set in motion in your body some of those things, because those thoughts are powerful. I want people to be careful about projecting too much negative energy, including labeling themselves with diseases. I like when people just stick with symptoms. Don't call it a scary disease, whatever, cancer included. Just say, okay, I don't feel well. I've got headaches. I'm not functioning as well as I want. These are my questions. Don't go any further. Not necessary to make a diagnosis with a label, because the labels sometimes create a new disease of their own, which is the fear that I'm going to die from that disease. So you can have the fear because you're not well, but you don't need to add to it any arbitrary label, because frankly, it's hard to pinpoint the diagnosis. So I think it's important for people, you don't have to go there, but you can ask the question, do I have Lyme disease? Do I have something else? Take your symptoms and go to somebody, start conventionally maybe. If you don't get satisfactory answers and results, then go to somebody who's got more information. Maybe a doctor who's got additional training, or maybe you go outside the box altogether, because there are a lot of people in different fields who have different understandings and can be very helpful. But you go, you present yourself, you list your symptoms, and then it gets tricky, because what we would normally like to see is somebody just take some blood out of her arm, send it to a lab, and 24 hours later comes back with, you have X, Y, or Z, or X, Y, and Z. And to some extent that satisfies people, even though they're now got a label, they feel at least the mystery is solved, and now I can get focused on what to do about it. But the problem with Lyme disease is it's not that neat. It's not that cooperative in terms of diagnosis. So you start having to think about, well, what's wrong with me? And look at it from a systems perspective. So the person that I would suggest people go find is somebody who can help them look at their system, their immune system, their gastrointestinal system, their nervous system, their psycho-emotional systems, and help them find better balance in each one. You mentioned glyphosate. All of us are exposed to a chemical that causes damage to our intestinal lining, that has all sorts of other effects in our body, from the bacteria that live in our intestines to the way our intestinal lining should be nice and tight, and not have holes, and not absorb things that don't belong inside our body. And there's an immune system barrier, and it's got its own integrity. When that gets impaired, all sorts of things fall apart. Somebody needs to look at that for anybody who's sick with anything. Somebody needs to look at our nervous system and the health and the nutrients that our neurons and our brain and our peripheral nervous system are dealt. Our other systems, whether it's our liver and our kidneys, which are very important organs for detox and chemical reactions and protein production. We have to look at each cell of our body and how it produces energy, our nutrients. Even if we think we have a good diet, are we absorbing our diet? Again, if our intestinal tract is impaired, we can have perfect food on our plate and it may not get anywhere near our bloodstream. And so that's a systems approach. Somebody helps looking at all your systems, just like the easiest way to use the analogy is if I am a auto racer, I race cars. I've got this car that should be going at 205 miles an hour. How do you think those mechanics get that car to go 205 miles an hour? I mean, not every car can drive 205 miles an hour. Well, they look at four tires, they make sure they're aligned, the tread is right. They look at the grease everywhere. They take out everything that has a hole in the tube and clean it out. They, so to make sure the fuel is right. They make sure everything else is in alignment, that the spark plugs work and every filter is, they look at every single thing to tweak that car to go 205 miles an hour, because you lose if you go 204 miles an hour. And so when it comes to our bodies and our immune system and all the things that go on, we need to be systematic and comprehensive. You can't just look at the gastrointestinal tract. You can't just look at the immune system. You can't just kill organisms. You have to pull it all together. And you take yourself to somebody who systematically will work with every system of your body to improve it. When that happens, just as an aside, you basically set the ground for treatment. That's can be helpful. Sometimes that's enough to put people over the line. But on top of that, then you usually need targeted supplements, specific nutrients, sometimes antimicrobials, other things that support because you are sick. You're not just the systems that's falling apart, but you've got invaders in your body. You've got toxic material that's been stored there for a long time that needs to be cleared out. And even though you want the organs of your body to be in good shape, they may need assistance.
So
This
yeah,
is a comprehensive approach.
so Lyme's disease is not just one block. Lyme's disease is could be many blocks, and those blocks. Well, we need to look at the body, and we need to look at whole body healing, not partial body healing, and not target the Lyme so much, but go in and empower the body.
So well said. Not target the Lyme so much. It's
Yeah.
there. We know it's there. We know I'm not ignoring it.
No.
But to get there, we don't have to name it. We don't have to label it because it's the Lyme syndrome that we're talking about now is many things. And so to get the car back to 205 miles an hour, we need to address many things. We can't fix 3 of the 4 tires.
Right.
We can't worry about 7 of the 8 spark plugs. There is a need to do it all. Now that's, for most people, that's a lot of work. That's a lot more than they signed up for, and they'll say it. On top of it all, you know what? It takes years. It doesn't take weeks. It doesn't take months. It takes somewhere between, if you're lucky, 6 months, and it may take 5 years to do this once you're that sick. And if you don't have sort of some willing ability to accept that reality and you think everything should be done quickly and rush and not systematically, then you're going to have a 5-foot ladder.
So I have another question too. The state that the world is in, the state that your environment is in, that you live in, that you create, is that what's unearthing all these old diseases and old bacteria? Because we do hear them; they're starting to show their little heads again, aren't they?
Yeah, well, you could say yes. If you look at a number of different seemingly disparate epidemics, Lyme syndrome being one, Alzheimer's being another, autism being another. You look at those and you say, do they have anything in common? Because, it's just an interesting epidemiological observation. Well, what's particularly interesting about those 3 things that I mentioned, if you look at curves of the incidence of those disease over the years, and you looked at, let's start in 1900. From 1900 to around 1975, all those diseases existed, and there was sort of a 1 out of 10,000, whatever the number was. Somewhere around 1975, all of them, the curve started to go up. Autism, Alzheimer's, Lyme disease. What happened right before 1975? Well, again, I don't want to just lay this all on glyphosate, but it's pretty interesting timing. And I'm not sure it's just glyphosate because the same year the FDA was doing that, they were also doing many other things that were similarly sort of and maybe somewhat unintentionally ignorant or willfully disinterested in environmental impact on human health and allowing all sorts of things to happen. And this was accumulating. Maybe just got to some critical mass around that. Maybe glyphosate was the final straw. Maybe glyphosate has nothing to do with it. But I think you're right. If you look at the incidence of disease, somewhere around the 1970s, all these things and certain types of cancer, breast cancer in particular, started to rise in incidence. Now, if you look at where they were rising, what parts of the United States, as an example, you find some interesting subsequent observations. So Lyme disease now is most prevalent in the United States in the Southeast, specifically in the Mississippi River Delta. And what goes into the Mississippi River? All the runoff from all the farms in the Midwest. And what is in all the farms in the Midwest? Glyphosate. And so even to this day. And so the incidence of these diseases now, that's not how it happened early, but it seems like this is definitely compounding the problem.
The perfect storm.
I don't know, but I think these are perfect storms colliding now.
Yes.
And so the answer to the question about human health in the 21st century is we've got to address the environment at the same time we address individual health. And that one person can't expect to be healthy if they don't look in the home they live in and the immediate environment around them. And that then includes, something you mentioned, all these, wireless networks. Who knows what these things are doing? It concerns me. As one other factor, electromagnetic fields, in addition to the toxic physical pollution of things like metals and chemicals.
And if I can say something, I want your opinion on this, to weigh in on it, if you don't mind. But, this is not a generalization or a pointing finger thing. But I'll tell you right now, when I'm dealing with people, and whether it's when it comes to chronic disease, and I'm only going to say that I've noticed this with Lyme's, the more fearful the person is, the more anxiety they have, the more their symptoms are blown right out. And
Right.
if they don't pull back those wild horses, oh my gosh, everything goes. I don't know if you've noticed that, but the actual personality of the person, how well they manage their emotions, how well they react to certain things. I'll tell you, I'm working with a whole bunch of Lymes right now. And as soon as there's a bit of trauma, or they just blow right out again.
Yeah, well, this is evidence of the connection between the mind and the body.
Yeah.
And it's a really tough situation. If your body is sick, your mind is going to suffer. You're going to be depressed. You're going to be upset. You're going to be angry. And when you're angry, your body gets upset. And so it's a vicious cycle. Once it gets started, it's not even sure what came first. It's not just angry people get Lyme disease. It's not just people who are upset or mentally, sensitive, emotionally sensitive get Lyme disease. That's not the case. But what is typical is people, once they have chronic disease like Lyme disease, they tend to be more sensitive. And that's because of the impairment of their nervous system. But then it feeds right back into it. It makes it worse. So you're right. Part of the treatment has to be to help people regain some balance in the psycho-emotional state. It's very difficult, but it's a feature of a good protocol, is to help people deal with that fear and anxiety and the pain and the anger and the upset. If you don't address it, and you treat just the body, thinking that somehow the mind will get better after the body gets better, and this is what a lot of people mistake themselves. Just get my body better and my mind will get better. No, you have to do both. And to do the mind part is tricky. It's really hurting. And it's not psychotherapy. It's not, the typical stuff. It's the autonomic nervous system. It's the way our mind goes into fear. You used it, and it was brilliant. Bring your fear down so you can bring your faith up. I wrote that down. Fear, this anxiety, is contributing. One has to figure out how to deal with it. So part of it, though, is to go to somebody, a practitioner or a set of practitioners who help you. Don't rely on, don't put all this on your own shoulders and burden yourself with every aspect of it. You've got to take care of yourself. You have to feed yourself wisely. You have to address all these different variables and all these systems, but you need help. Not only do you need professional help in terms of, smart practitioners who are also caring, but you may need a community of people who support you emotionally. And you may need a type of therapist who helps you express these emotions so that they're not all bottled up in a healthy way. But it's challenging. It's a very big factor. And sometimes it takes over, meaning sometimes what impairs people the most is their emotional state eventually. Their body is definitely hurting, but what really in disables them is the fact that they don't feel good. They don't feel happy. They're not in joy. They're not loving life. And that's a disease, dis-ease, as we talked about in the previous show.
So I have a question for you, and that is this, is that we know that Lyme's disease is a complex disease. We know that it's a layered disease. So here's my question is it's not just a bacterial or not just a viral infection that we can knock out and then get back into alignment or get back on course. So what does the future look like in dealing with Lyme if it's like it takes a 20-prong approach when most people don't do that?
Well, I think I would say there's two prongs to focus on.
Okay.
One is the individual. So each person needs to just clean up their own immediate environment, which is their physical space that they live in, and then their internal territory, their body and what's inside their body. And you just have to do better. Not perfect, again, as we talked about, but clean it up, address the systems comprehensively over time, stay with it, be patient, but persist.
And be happy and stay in the moment, like you said in the last show.
As best as possible.
Yeah.
Find joy. Yeah, listen to great music.
Yeah.
Look at beauty. Take pain that you may experience and make art. Draw paintings, pictures. As hard as it is, every little bit will help. The other is a collective responsibility. This is asking us all to pay attention to what's going on in the environment. These epidemics are happening now. It's as if Mother Nature is rebelling and is trying to kill us, frankly. We are killing it, the planet, and the planet, if it had a consciousness of its own, which I would say it very well might, would look at us as invaders. We are the infection on planet Earth. And if you were planet Earth with a consciousness and seeing humans infecting you, what would you want to do to it?
Make them the filters.
You would want to get rid of them.
Yeah.
And how would you get rid of them if you had all of nature at your disposal? Well, I would throw at them all sorts of altered organisms. Maybe some of it's at the hands of man himself. On the other hand, perhaps this is sort of a collective consciousness. We're in trouble here. We could have a whole similar conversation on the environment, on climate change, on habitat destruction, on whales. We could talk about anything we want, and we would wind up with the same bottom line point, which is the second prong. We've got to pay attention to what's going on in the entire ecosystem here, and we've got to do better collectively to address it. We need to affect legislation when it comes to our politics in terms of what's being allowed in terms of continue to perpetrate this type of insult on the planet and the health of every living thing. And we need to do better in terms of the harmony among people in the world, specifically peace. And those forces, the individual taking responsibility for themselves, cleaning up their own backyard, and then us bonding together. My hope is that we'll be some critical mass. I'm absolutely certain not everyone wants to do this. There are many people who are very happy with war. They're very happy with the bonus they get at the end of the year when they sell, a zillion products. So there's some people who are going to keep trying to pull us in the other direction. But the collective masses, like all of us, are hurting and are aware of this. Maybe are more silent, but the silent majority. We need to take action. And it's to come together and help each other and help the planet. Part of it is to recognize these syndromes for what they are. This is symptoms of a collective disease of a planet that's not healthy.
Thank you, Michael. So I think the big takeaway here is take massive personal action and show others that we have the possibility that we can heal, that we can heal from anything. But you must take massive personal action, which means that you've got to be selfish enough, and I don't use the word selfish in a negative way, but selfish enough to know what your needs are just to get well.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
understand that Superman's not coming, but Michael is, right?
well, the words that I'm expressing hopefully will filter into somebody's
Yes.
business and inspire them to shift from I'd love this to be easy and just be a pill and I'll be over in a week to a recognition that this is a lifelong process. And this may be our collective mission at this time. The meaning of our lives that we talk about may not be for each of us to fulfill a particular destiny, but maybe at this point in a stage of time in human history is for us collectively to work together. The meaning of our lives is the collective, that when we work together and create beautiful music together, the symphony and the harmony and everything that's created will heal the ages and the centuries and the millennia of various types of abuse that have gone on unchecked to this point. And this is our cause. This is to turn it around. But it's not to fight it in war, because I think that energy is antithetical to the healing that we're seeking, but it's to fight it with peace, with love, with I'm going to love my body. I'm going to love these organisms, even Lyme disease. Lyme disease is not killing me, it's waking me up. And if I respond to it that way, as a friend that's tapping me on the shoulder, this is a leap, I admit. But if I can somehow embrace the message and respond accordingly, Lyme disease will have taught me something that's very powerful. And if I survive it, and I help other people survive it, and thrive with it, and we heal the planet because that's what's called for here as well, then we've made the most of this challenge. And that's what how I would reframe and shape this, I would say, project.
Wouldn't it be something if tomorrow we all woke up realizing that the same God, creator, source that created the whole universe created every one of us, and that we are all family, and that we shouldn't be going around hurting each other? I mean, if we all woke up going, I choose today to love everyone on this planet, I think that it would be just like the Matrix. It would all just go.
It's a shift. It's a shift to even look at the infections that hurt us and embrace them.
Yes.
You know, we could look at a little, I don't know, we can look at lions on the Serengeti Plain, and when they're little cubs, they're very cute. You know, when they grow up, they're lethal. We could watch a lion take down a gazelle, which is also very cute. And we could watch this sort of objectively, and we can accept the reality that they're all trying to survive. That's all that's trying to do. Well, why wouldn't we say the same thing about a bacteria? Why would we feel like there's something lesser than in terms of the desire of this bacteria to survive and just live? If we could create harmony and everyone gets fed and everyone lives in consciousness and in beauty, that's a very different way of being. That's what's being called for now. We have lived thousands of years in a certain model: competition, limited resources, fear of death. It's time for us to shift.
Really?
To
Yeah.
something different.
We have unlimited potential in everything, and I don't believe that. The world's not too small. We don't have too many people. There's enough water. There's enough food. There's enough money. There's enough air. You know, this is just dramatization over the time, and I know it's just craziness, and it drives everybody mental, so I don't even listen to that stuff anymore. But what people need to, I believe they really need to understand is you got 50 trillion cells, but you got 500 trillion bacteria. You're not a walking human being, tissue human being. You're a walking glob of bacteria, and our bacteria is our second brain. So understand that when your bacteria turn on you, it's because you turned on them. What do you think, Michael?
Right. I think everything is connected, even more than looking at them as sort of separate from ourselves. They're sort of so intimately connected on levels of energy and exchange of molecules and substance. It's very hard to draw a line between what's human and not human. And that includes the rest of the planet as well. When we think of ourselves and see ourselves and describe ourselves as separate, this is when we get into competition. When we see ourselves as one, we say, how can everyone do well? Because I wouldn't want to cut off my left hand. I mean, I could use my right by itself. I'd rather everything come along together. If we shift to that mentality, getting back to your question about fear and anxiety and all of it, we live much differently. We're in love. We're floating in a sea of support. We have far less to fear. It's not easy because we have been raised and trained, and eons have gone by with a certain model. And there's all sorts of industries out there that support the alternative because they profit from it. But it's time for people who are smart, who are conscious, to take charge. And we can. And with that, there is a new future. And the future is to coexist and to live in harmony and to reach our fullest potential in consciousness, whatever that plan ultimately is.
Beautiful, Michael. So, Michael, can you tell everybody where they can get your book, how they can get in touch with you, how they can talk with you, how they can communicate with you?
Yeah, so I've written a book called Slow Medicine. Essentially, I describe what we've been talking about, which is the fast world, this world that we're living in, which is hurting us. And I consider it to be the fast world. It's bombarding us. And so if fast is the disease, then slow is the medicine. So the book's title is Slow Medicine. And that can be found in anywhere you buy books. And then the website for most of the other relevant information about how to reach me and what I've written and where I'll be is slowmedicine.org. And I love when people send me emails directly, michael@sunraven.org. Sunraven is the name of the farm I live in, outside of New York, close to Lyme, Connecticut. It's always raises my heart when somebody has heard anything that I've said and it resonates with them, or even if they have a question. Even if what I said doesn't feel good to somebody, I'd like to know what that is, because I'm always interested in learning more, and I want to be a better communicator of some of the things that I believe in. I want to help people. So if people want to write to me, michael@sunraven.org is the email address.
Thank you, Michael. So everybody out there, so now this is our second show, okay? The first show we did was how to age healthy. Now this show is all about Lyme, so we want your questions, so you can put your questions in on Intercom, YouTube, Facebook, okay? You can call them into our staff if you want, or you can join us live for the Q&A. The Q&A will be in 2 days. So let everybody know, because we're going to be talking about how we can age young, feeling vibrant, feeling youthful, and how we can get rid of the so-called normal aging that most people are doing. Okay? And understand something. We want your questions. Don't be afraid to challenge Michael, Dr. Michael Finkelstein, or myself. Okay? Bring those questions in. And so we want you to question us on both of these shows. And we're going to do a Q&A in a couple of days. And then, you know what? It'll be a little bit, maybe in a few weeks, we'll be coming back on. And I'll be bringing Michael on, and we'll be talking about cancer, where cancer is, where it might go, how to deal with it, and the emotional and physical effects of cancer, and what your options are. Okay? So, Michael, what would you like to leave our audience with before we meet them for the Q&A in a couple of days?
You know, sometimes I speak and the common pushback I get is it all sounds good, but it's hard for me. I don't feel good and I don't have the energy. And I want to just acknowledge it's not easy, and that I feel for people. That said, the way from here to there is to take care of yourself. And what you need for that is some good information and some good guidance, and dig deep into your heart as far as what resonates and follow that path. I think most people know what they need, and hopefully what I've shared with you will be useful in that regard.
Thank you very much for joining me today, Dr. Finkelstein. I am excited to have you back Monday, January the 27th at 3 p.m. Pacific Standard Time to answer all the questions from our viewers on today's and yesterday's live show. For everyone watching who wants to learn more about Lyme's disease, join me next Wednesday January 29th at 3 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, we have Larry Langdon, an inventor and the creator of what I believe to be one of the most powerful PEMF systems that combats the symptoms of Lyme and other diseases. Just know this, not only has he developed one of the most powerful PEMF devices to date, but he used this same device to eliminate Lyme's disease that caused him to be bedridden. So join us next Wednesday. And understand, when you're watching on YouTube, don't forget to subscribe below and make sure you click on the bell to enable notifications so that you never miss a show. And just know that all our Q&As are time-stamped so that you can find your question easily. Go to YouTube, all the questions that we do with all our Q&As, whether we're talking about the Q&A with Dr. Finkelstein, whether we're talking about the Q&A with Larry Langdon and his PMF device, whether we're talking about the Q&As that I do on Mondays and Fridays, go to YouTube and you'll find the questions that you want answered. And you'll find that the answers will be there and waiting for you if you don't watch the show live. Again, I want to thank Dr. Finkelstein and all my listeners who make this show possible. God bless everyone. Take your power back to heal. Better still, stop giving it away. And remember, it's just like this. 3, 2, 1, you got this. Have a beautiful day. If you're looking for life-saving and life-changing information, well, you've come to the right place. Don't forget to click and subscribe. Stay connected.